Our guest on this edition of Arts Alive Books is Oscar de Muriel, who was born in Mexico City, and at a young age, Oscar was thrilled, inspired and petrified by the novel Jurassic Park, which made him decide that he wanted to be a writer too. He found his niche writing historical fiction. Arriving in the UK to complete a PhD on chemistry, Oscar began working as a freelance translator to complement his earnings. During numerous visits to Edinburgh, the impressive city galvanised his imagination, and feeling that the medieval Old Town, the elegant Georgian New Town, and various neoclassical buildings would be the perfect backdrop for a crime mystery. The resulting book, The Strings of Murder, is a ghostly crime mystery set in Victorian Edinburgh. The successive owners of a violin, allegedly played by the devil, meet gruesome and seemingly unconnected deaths. Described as a mesmerizing concoction of crime, history and horror, and favorably compared to Sherlock Holmes and Jonathan Creek, Oscar de Muriel joins us to tell us more. Welcome to Arts Alive Books, and welcome to Oscar de Muriel. Or should I say bienvenidos?
Muchas gracias.
All the way from Mexico?
Well, not today. I live in Warrington, but yeah, originally.
Warrington, Mexico.
Yeah.
And what brought you over here?
Well, I came originally to do a PhD in chemical engineering. In Manchester University, yeah.
Yeah.
And I sort of lingered. I got a job offer and just stayed on and started writing.
Yeah. Big difference?
Quite a bit, especially temperature-wise, rain-wise.
Yeah. Well, that's Northern England for you.
It could be worse. It could be Edinburgh.
So you got the day job, still working in chemistry?
I specialised in sewage treatment. So I work for the utility companies and dealing with smelly jobs.
That's interesting, because some of that features in this book as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was impossible not to just include a little bit of that in the end. Yeah. And I do get some of my main characters struggling and wading through sludge, which was really fun to write.
Always a good idea.
Yes.
So this is a hobby, but it's one that's becoming a greater part of your life.
I had this really good offer from Penguin, and there's a sequel coming. So at some point I had to decide, and if I want to become a writer, I have to make more time for it. Yeah. So now I pretty much divide my time between engineering and writing, which is quite good. Yeah.
So there's a number of interesting things about it. First of all, it's kind of a Victorian setting, isn't it?
Yes.
What attracts you about that?
Well, ever since I was very young, I was kind of drawn towards the Victorian British fiction, things like Dracula, Conan Doyle, H.G. Wells. Those were the books that I would naturally pick up and read without anyone telling me.
Why is that?
I don't know yet, because people ask me a lot about that. I just enjoyed them. There's all this atmosphere. I remember being 10, 11 and imagining the foggy streets of London, people having tea. So I don't know. I don't know if it has to do with the fact that I read when I was very young, that there's a bit of coziness about it.
Yeah, it's an enduringly potent image of late Victorian Britain, isn't it? Which
yes.
Conan Doyle supplies.
I think also it was a time of great social inequality. You had all the Industrial Revolution starting to take over the world. You had people living in slums, and 2 blocks away, people living in mansions. Some of that still happens in places like Mexico. I think that's probably why it attracts me as well.
And the second thing that's interesting about it, I think, is that it's a kind of crime thriller, isn't it? With a little bit of supernatural stuff thrown in.
Yeah.
And what draws you to that particularly? You've already mentioned Conan Doyle. Is it because of your kind of regard for him?
Well, I think it was a bit between Conan Doyle and Dracula as well. I just think that supernatural element is quite fitting for a Victorian setting.
Yeah.
And I remember reading the Hound of the Baskervilles and thinking this kind of belongs there.
Really? Yeah. And I suppose if you are talking about that late Victorian period and crime, I mean, the name of Jack the Ripper always seems to crop up.
Yeah, and actually it features briefly in the book as one of the, is the initial problem. There's this horrible murder of a violin virtuoso in Edinburgh on the exact same day when the most gruesome of Jack the Ripper murders took place. So Scotland Yard is fearing that they have an imitator in Edinburgh. So they think if one starts imitating it's just a matter of time before someone else imitates us in some other city.
Yeah.
And they try to keep everything secret away from the press. I think that's the main, the initial drive of the book.
And another thing that I kind of really like about it is that it's got a kind of musical theme to it. It's called Strings of Murder, and it's about a violinist, isn't it, or about a violin?
Yeah.
Where did that idea come from?
Well, I play the violin myself.
Oh, really?
And I think it's been like 15 years since I heard this legend about this real piece of music called the Devil's Trio Sonata. And it's always been in the back of my head. I just wanted to write a story about it. And I came up with various different ideas I didn't use in the end. And when I came up with the concept of this detective duo, I thought that's perfect story for the first case.
Yeah. So we got this kind of confluence of ideas. We've got the Victorian setting, we've got the kind of crime, and we've got music. That's a kind of very potent, interesting mix.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm reminded of the kind of Phantom of the Opera as well, to a certain
I
extent.
think it has some influence as well.
What's it like writing in a second language?
It wasn't as hard as I expected it was going to be. I had the idea and I didn't do much with it for like a year. And I was just jotting down lines about it. And there were really odd notes because I would start in Spanish and then I would think of the dialogue in English. So I would start a paragraph in one language and finish it in another one. Until one of my friends said, just write it in English. I wrote the first 2-3 chapters. A couple of friends read them and they said that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
You can do it.
Because it's not so much the kind of technical language, is it, with a book? It's
No,
about the
'cause,
kind of idioms and locutions and that
Yes.
kind of thing.
Yeah, because I was very used to writing the very academic language, for my thesis, but it's completely different. When you're writing a novel, you can tell the same thing in 100 different ways, and it's really choosing the right one for that precise moment. And also, I enjoyed a lot. Well, I'm a lot into linguistics. And I really enjoyed writing about the Scottish dialects and how the main character, who's from London, struggles when he goes to Scotland. And that has something I really like about Britain, that you travel 10 miles and they call something a completely different way. Like if you're in Manchester, you would call something a bun, and then you travel 10 miles and it's a muffin, and so on. Yeah. I just find it fascinating.
That's interesting. Yeah. So it's Detective Ian Frey is the principal character, isn't he? And you've got plans for him?
I have plans for him, yes. This is meant to be the first of a series. I just submitted the second one a couple of weeks ago. It's in the hands of my editor, at the moment. It's supposed to come out next February. And if I get it my way, I want to write 9 books about them.
9 books?
And I have pretty much drawn out the main plots for them.
Oh, for all not 9 books?
Yes.
Goodness, that's impressive.
Well, I had a lot of waiting time from finishing the book until it came public. So yeah, I took loads of notes and.
I suppose one of the things, I mean, it's a very popular thing to do now, isn't it, to write the kind of series, as it were, to the franchise. What if you got to book 4 and you suddenly decided that you wanted to do something completely different?
Well, there's always that risk. So I've tried not to plot things so tightly. I try to give myself some leeway. Yeah. But yeah, there's always the risk that you want to go in a different direction. I'm not that worried about it right now because I have a lot of freedom. But I'm thinking might come the moment, like book 7, and I think, I just cornered myself. I can't do this. I want to do that.
And what if it's kind of really successful? And I certainly hope it is, because it's brilliantly written and very well plotted, and the call comes in from Hollywood, and they're going to make a big Hollywood version of it. Would you still live in Wigan?
Probably not. Yeah, it's the weather mainly. I don't know if you watch the weather forecast. There's always like a cloud above Manchester and the Merseyside area. I really like Lancashire. I lived there a couple of years. And actually, the second book is set in Lancashire. It's about involving the Pendle Witches.
Oh, brilliant. Okay.
So I'm really looking forward.
Okay, well, thanks very much for joining us for the first half. Please stay with us for part 2, when we'll be talking to Oscar again about one of his favourite authors, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Oscar de Muriel is our studio guest today. Oscar, we talked a little bit in the first half about Conan Doyle, and he's the author that you want to focus on a little bit for the second part of the show. What attracts you about him as a writer?
I've been thinking for a long time what it is. I can't really pinpoint it. There's several things of his books that I really enjoy. First, as I mentioned, that I read them very early on, and there's that bit of coziness whenever I come back and read them. Another thing that I really enjoy from detective fiction is the kind of almost interactive side of it. You're always trying to get ahead of the detective and just trying to gather the clues yourself. And that's something I remember really enjoying when I was as a child. Although Conan Doyle almost always beat me. There was only a couple of cases where I actually managed to. Yeah.
Did you read in English or in Spanish?
First in Spanish. I must have been like 12, 13. But then I think that actually The Hound of the Baskervilles was the first one I read in English. Yeah. I remember really, really enjoying it.
It's a very striking story, isn't it?
It is, yes. Yeah. And I remember rereading it once I came to the UK. And all the details, like the moves, the fog, kind of completely new meaning. That's the other thing I really like about Conan Doyle, and I think makes him a bit different from other detectives. Is that he actually writes about a very atmospheric story, very atmospheric settings. You can picture yourself in Sherlock's study, and Hound of the Baskervilles. You go to the hall, and you think you're there, you believe you're there, and all the relationships between Sherlock and Dr. Watson.
Yeah. What do you think of the kind of way he's been reinvented over the last 10 years or so with the television and the film series?
Well, I think it's been done for a modern audience. So there are things that I quite like the Downey Jr. It's a proper action thriller.
Yeah.
There are other things that I believe have had to be done for modern audiences, like they have embellished Irene Adler, who was in a very short story, but now, of course, it's a much more complex. Much
She was an
more
opera
elaborate
singer,
character.
wasn't she, in Scandal in
She was in
Bohemia?
yeah.
So there's the music and crime and Victoriana mix again.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I like Conan Doyle so much is that, I mean, it seems very kind of superficial in some ways. It's just a detective story. It keeps you turning the page to find out who did it. You're certainly right about the atmosphere. He's a kind of master of that.
Yeah, because I compare him to, some people are going to kill me for saying this, Agatha Christie. And I find Agatha Christie's books a bit more as a mere puzzle. It's more of a puzzle.
Puzzle, yeah.
Sherlock Holmes stories are, especially the later ones, are more of an actual atmospheric, more human stories.
I think part of that atmosphere is that there's a kind of darkness to them as well, isn't there?
Yeah.
That kind of tells us a little bit about the period in which it was written, but also speaks to a kind of a darkness that's kind of abroad.
Yeah, and Sherlock Holmes is, when you think about it, he's a very dark figure. He's very arrogant. His cocaine addictions and all that. And I think, well, nowadays you have some other detectives that kind of try to borrow that, but I think he's the archetypical, super complex, dark detective.
Yeah, yeah. And he's on our side, isn't he? That's one of the reasons we like him, because you know that most of the time he's going to find the answer. He's going to sort things out.
Yeah,
it
exactly.
Reassures us.
Yeah, again, the coziness that you trust him. He will solve the mystery, even if you don't get the clues. He will.
So you mentioned Agatha Christie. Is there any other sort of post Conan Doyle detectives that you like?
Actually, I remember reading a lot of Edgar Allan Poe,
Okay.
but that's Brie.
That's Brie, yeah.
Yeah.
Or is there any kind of Spanish equivalence? I mean, there must be a detective genre in.
Well, it's not a popular genre in Latin America, but there's this one series it's called Hector Velasco Aranchain, which is about they're more of a satire books. He's an extremely funny and also quite dark detective. Yeah. He's half French and half Irish, which is quite odd.
That's interesting.
Living in Mexico City.
Yeah.
They are amazing books. I'm not sure if you can get them in English.
I was quite removed as well from the kind of American variation, isn't it? The kind of the mean streets, the whole thing coming out of kind of the pulp tradition, the film noir tradition, that kind of thing.
Sorry.
I'm just saying this particular genre, the one that kind of comes out of Doyle, is quite different from the American variation. It's the hard-boiled detective and so on.
Yeah, well, I think the American fiction tends to be more kind of hands-on action. And I find the British detective is more purely intellectual, deductive.
And the other interesting thing about Conan Doyle, I suppose, is that it leads into another of your interests, or one of your kind of inspirations, Jurassic Park, because he wrote The Lost World, didn't he?
He wrote The Lost World, yeah.
1912.
Yeah, and then his title was stolen by Michael Crichton
for
his sequel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an extraordinary book, and it's also an extraordinary story, the way it was kind of filmed so often.
Yeah, and also he introduces this other series of characters in The Lost World. And I think between Conan Doyle and Michael Crichton, they just ruined dinosaurs for all other writers, because there's no other way to write about them.
It's a fantastic, for people who don't know, it's set on a plateau in the kind of heart of the Amazonian jungle, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of area where the evolution effectively stopped.
And it introduces the character of Professor Challenger.
Challenger, yeah.
Yeah, who kind of features in a number of...
Another one of my favourite Victoriana characters, yeah.
And Conan Doyle was caught up in a couple of kind of controversies, wasn't he, around about this time?
Well, I quite like that contradiction of his character, because on one hand he wrote about the most intelligent, rational detective,
yeah.
and on the other hand he believed in spiritualism. When he lost his wife, he would organize these spiritist sessions to try and communicate with the dead. There was this fairy picture fraud, and he was one of the main supporters of it.
Yeah.
So he really did believe.
There was a lot of it around, wasn't there, around about the First World War? The seance really came into its own as people trying to connect with the dead, of which there were so many.
Yeah, it was kind of like a movement of the time. I don't know if it's because rational thinking was kind of taking over, and people were trying to cling to the old beliefs and superstition.
Yeah, well, you've talked very interestingly and compellingly about Conan Doyle. I think I'd like to go back and read some of it again through your eyes, as it were, and seeing it, because, yeah. Oscar, thanks very much for coming in and talking to us today. And if you have any comments or suggestions for the show, please do contact us at artsalivebooks@baytvliverpool.com. And we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you on the next edition of Arts Alive Books. Good night.